They came out of Fold Transit at 3:41 station time, which is to say they came in the dark, which is to say they expected darkness to cover them. I was on the bridge of the unbroken record when the transit bloom lit up sensor array 9. Not an alarm. We did not do alarms for this. The board simply changed color, from the cool amber of a quiet watch to the deep red of a contact we had been cataloging since before my grandmother's grandmother drew her first breath. My sensor chief, a compact woman named Adiz Moriku, did not even raise her voice. She turned to me from her station, held my gaze for exactly 2 seconds and said, "Captain, they're here." I had waited 31 years for those 2 words. The recollection archive had been waiting 500,000. I set down my tea. I want to be precise about what happened in the minutes that followed, because precision is how we honor the people who made those minutes possible. They were not dramatic minutes in the way that entertainment prefers. There was no running. There was no shouting. Every officer on the bridge of the unbroken record moved with the unhurried economy of people who had rehearsed this specific scenario so many times that the novelty had been scraped completely away, leaving only the task. That is what preparation looks like from the inside. That is what 500,000 years of institutional memory buys you. Not speed, exactly. Not even readiness as a feeling. Readiness as a reflex so deeply grooved that the mind steps aside and the body simply acts. I keyed the fleet-wide channel and said, "Contact confirmed. Transit bloom consistent with Vreth fold signature. All vessels execute standing order pale vigil. Weapons hold." Then I released the key and watched my crew do their work. The Vreth continuance materialized as 11 vessels. That was important. 11 was a ritual number for the Vreth. The recollection archive had documented it thoroughly across the 17 previous harvest approaches in humanity's recorded history, stretching back to the earliest recoverable genomic evidence of contact, which the archive's deep-time xenobiologists had dated to approximately 530,000 years before the present. 11 vessels meant this was an official reclamation mission under Vreth continuance doctrine, not a scouting wing, not a rogue element, not an opportunist raider. This was the full institutional weight of the Vreth continuance acting in its own name. They had returned to check on the dormant holdings. They had returned to see whether the livestock were ready. The flagship was the one we had designated Vigil Primary in the tactical files. It ran dark, the way they always did on approach, no navigational emissions, no communication signals, no active sensors. Classic harvest approach posture, honed over tens of thousands of years of preying on pre-spaceflight civilizations. Move in quiet, get close, broadcast the harvest codes, and let the biologically implanted compliance responses do the rest. It had worked on humanity once. The archive held the evidence. Long gray shapes descending through a sky that held no answer, and a people below who felt in their own blood an imperative they did not understand and could not name, who walked toward the ships not knowing why, who did not yet have the language to call it what it was. We had the language now. Vigil Primary is holding at 14,000 kilometers, Moriku said, consistent with historical staging depth. They'll begin assessment scans in approximately 7 minutes. Let them, I said. The 2 officers flanking the bridge, Lieutenant Commander Diko Faris on my left, Tactical Officer Una Preslur on my right, exchanged the briefest glance. Not fear, not nerves, something more like reverence, or perhaps the particular stillness that comes when a very long sentence finally reaches its final word. I felt it too. I had spent my entire adult life in the Fleet of Recollection, the branch of Earth's unified defense structure specifically organized and maintained for this single scenario, the return of the Vreth. I had spent 31 years studying Vreth doctrine, Vreth biology, Vreth tactical signatures, Vreth psychology insofar as the archive had been able to reconstruct it from recovered biological control mechanisms, from the residual genetic architecture left in the human genome. traces we had not managed to fully excise even after 500,000 years of deliberate effort, traces we had instead learned to identify and study, because that knowledge was itself a kind of weapon. I had spent 31 years reading the reports of the 27 academies and institutes and deep-time laboratories that collaborated to maintain the institutional memory of the Harvest era, because the one thing every generation of Fleet of Recollection Command had agreed on, going back to the founding documents 500,000 years ago, was this: we could not let ourselves forget. We were not allowed to forget. Forgetting was what the Vreth relied on. So we had not forgotten. I looked at the main tactical display. The 11 Vreth vessels were moving in their standard assessment formation, the flagship stationary at depth, 10 subordinate vessels in a slow orbital drift around it, creating a sensor net. They were reading the planet. From their perspective, the planet would be emitting signals consistent with an advanced technological civilization, which it was, but the Vreth had encountered advanced technological civilizations before and had incorporated them regardless. The Vreth continuance operated on a biological logic, not a technological one. They were not invaders in the conventional sense. They were not here to conquer or to destroy. They were here to harvest. They were the farmers. We were, in their taxonomy, the crop. What they were reading was technology. What they had not yet registered was scale. That would change. They're beginning the assessment scan, Moriku said. Passive broadband, they're mapping the surface. I nodded. 30 seconds. In 30 seconds, their scan would resolve enough to begin cross-referencing against the Vreth continuance's own agricultural records, the vast biological census they had maintained across their client species for what their own history suggested was somewhere between 400,000 and 600,000 years. Earth would be in those records. A young, promising harvest world, high-grade neural complexity, favorable atmospheric profile, good yield metrics. They had listed it as dormant after the last reclamation mission, which our deep historians had dated to approximately 380,000 years ago. They had noted the harvest was below expectations due to early-stage resistance behaviors in the crop population. They had noted the resistance was consistent with a nascent cooperative intelligence adaptation and had flagged it for monitoring on the next cycle. The next cycle had come. They had been waiting, in their way, to see whether the resistance behavior had been bred out or had simply been a phase. The scan resolved. I watched the flagship's emission profile change on Moriku's board. A subtle spike, a shift in the frequency range that the archive had long ago identified as consistent with a Vreth crew receiving unexpectedly high-complexity data from an assessment target. "They're confused," Moriku said quietly. She was reading the signature off the passive sensor feed, and she had spent 20 years learning to interpret Vreth vessel behavior from nothing but passive emissions. "The scale isn't matching their records." "No," I said, "it wouldn't." What they were seeing was this: a planet whose surface was covered, from pole to pole, in a continuous network of megacity corridors, many of them older than human recorded writing, built and rebuilt over 500 millennia of uninterrupted civilization. A biosphere not abandoned, not dormant, not struggling, but thoroughly and irreversibly occupied by a species that had had 500,000 years to make itself comfortable. The Veth Plateau corridor alone, beneath us, visible through the bridge's forward transparency as a smear of amber light stretching to both horizons, housed 11 billion people. The broader equatorial band held something over 100 billion. Orbital space was layered: defense platforms, transit stations, manufacturing rings, agricultural arrays, communication relays, so densely layered that from the Vreth assessment scan it would have appeared less like a space around a planet and more like a second, skeletal planet superimposed on the first. And in the sky above it all, the fleet. Not just my fleet, not just the fleet of recollection. Every branch of Earth's unified defense structure had been in position for 6 months, since the long-range observatories at the fold transit threshold had first detected the pre-signature tremor that indicated a large vessel group was preparing to transition. We had known they were coming before they had finished choosing their exit coordinates. We had had time to position 41,000 warships across every orbital band, every atmospheric layer, every approach vector. 41,000 warships, most of them larger than the Vreth flagship by a factor the Vreth's engineering traditions would have classified as physically implausible. None of them were transmitting. None of them were active on sensors. They were sitting in the dark, just as the Vreth were sitting in the dark, and for exactly the same reason. Because broadcasting your position was for people who weren't already sure they were where they needed to be. I want to describe the sky that morning, because I think it matters. The upper atmosphere above the Veth Plateau corridor was clear. A high-pressure system had pushed the equatorial cloud layer south 2 days prior, which our meteorological forecasters had noted in the pre-deployment briefing with the dry satisfaction of people whose job intersects weather and warfare in unexpected ways. What that meant practically was that anyone on the surface who had reason to look up that morning would have been able to see, with the naked eye, the lowest tier of the orbital defense platforms. A bright, slow-moving ring lit by the angled pre-dawn sun, its individual segments distinct as pearls on a string. Above it, invisible to the naked eye but fully present to anyone with even basic sensor equipment, the second tier. And above that, the third. And above that, in the deep orbital band, the warship fleet sitting dark and quiet and unbroken from horizon to horizon. The world had had 500,000 years to build that view. Every generation had added something. There was a saying in the fleet of recollection, older than I could trace, that I had heard in every posting I had ever held. The sky belongs to those who remember why it matters. I had never been certain whether that was poetry or doctrine. Standing on the bridge of the unbroken record on the morning the Vreth came back, watching the pre-dawn light catch the orbital ring, I decided it was both. The flagship held position for 9 more minutes. I drank my tea. Around me, 40 officers maintained their stations with the quiet efficiency that the fleet of recollection bred into its people, because there was no other kind of efficiency worth having when the thing you were waiting for had been coming for your entire life, and the entire life of every generation before you. Haste, in this room, would have felt obscene, like swatting at something holy. At the 12-minute mark, the flagship broadcast. I had known it was coming. The archive had documented the Vreth harvest codes thoroughly, had, in fact, spent several centuries decoding them from the biological traces left in the human genome, where 400,000 years of intermittent Vreth contact had left deep signatures. The harvest codes were not spoken language. They were a specific electromagnetic signal pattern designed to interact with biological implants the Vreth had seeded into subject species across multiple generations, creating involuntary compliance responses. For the early populations of humanity, contact with the codes had meant disorientation, compulsion, a sense of terrible calm. Walk toward the ship. Do not resist. Do not remember. I think about those early people often. Not with pity exactly, they do not need my pity and they would not have wanted it, but with something. With the knowledge that the thing in their blood had been put there without their consent, by something that had looked at them and seen only yield. That the calm they had felt walking toward those ships had not been peace, but the absence of the ability to refuse. That the first act of resistance, the first person who understood what was happening and found a way to say no, even imperfectly, even only in the telling afterward, had been an act of extraordinary will against something biological and designed. The archive had records of that first resistance, fragmentary, recovered from the deepest archaeological strata, from civilizations that had existed before current recorded history. It was not heroic in the way the word gets used. It was small and human and imperfect, and it had mattered more than anything. Our genomic architects had spent the better part of 200,000 years working to systematically dismantle the harvest implants. Not all of them were gone. Some were too deeply integrated into related neurological architecture to excise cleanly without damage. But those that remained had been mapped with extraordinary precision, and the compliance pathways had been interrupted, one by one, through a combination of deliberate genetic modification, engineered countersequences, and a standing program of pharmaceutical prophylaxis that had been standard issue to all fleet of recollection personnel for as long as the fleet had existed. The harvest codes broadcast across the fleet. Nothing happened. Around me, 40 officers continued what they had been doing. Moriku continued reading her sensors. Faris continued monitoring the tactical display. Preslur continued running weapons lock confirmations on the escort array. The bridge hum continued. The tea in my cup was still warm. I said, "Acknowledge the signal." My communications officer, a young man named Tev Ashind, who was on his first active contact deployment, and who, to his considerable credit, had not displayed so much as a tremor since Vigil Primary had resolved on the boards, opened the channel to the Vreth flagship and played back a recording. The recording was in Vreth communication protocol, not the harvest codes, but the diplomatic contact standard the archive had reconstructed from recovered Vreth signals over several thousand years of passive intelligence work. We had very quietly gotten quite good at Vreth. The message Ashind played was brief and precise. It said, in Vreth diplomatic standard, your signal was received. It did not produce the anticipated effect. You are invited to explain your purpose before we explain ours. The flagship went silent. I counted 14 seconds. Then its emission profile changed in a way Moriku had never documented before. She said so aloud, her voice carrying a note of careful professional interest, the way a scholar sounds when a primary source does something unexpected. "I'm seeing a new signature, Captain. It looks like internal communication. A lot of it, faster than their standard crew command cycles." "That's a collective deliberation spike," I said. "It means the continuance is arguing." In Vreth biology, the continuance was not a command structure in the human sense. The flagship housed something more like a distributed processing node, a cluster of senior Vreth who, in moments of unexpected input, would enter a collective deliberation cycle, pooling perception and memory and analytical capacity across multiple individuals until consensus emerged. It was efficient. It was also, as the archive had noted, profoundly unsuited to environments where speed of decision mattered more than quality of consensus. Faris spoke from his station without turning. "Do we want to push them? Run the secondary contact protocol?" "No," I said. "We have time. We have all the time in the world." I meant it literally. They deliberated for 4 minutes and 17 seconds. Then the flagship's secondary array lit up, active sensors, suddenly, a full tactical scan, not the passive agricultural assessment they had been running before. They were trying to get a complete picture. They were trying to understand what they were looking at. "Active scan across all bands," Moriku confirmed. "They're reading everything." Everything included the 41,000 warships that had been sitting dark in the orbital bands above us. The active scan swept through the orbital layers from low to high, taking approximately 90 seconds to complete the full pass. I watched it happen in real time on the tactical overlay, the scan beam moving through tier after tier of the defense infrastructure, each tier lighting up on the passive return feed as the Vreth systems cataloged what they found and fed it back to the flagship's assessment architecture. Tier 1. The lower orbital defense platforms, their weapons arrays pointing outward, their sensor suites already locked on the Vreth formation. Tier 2. The mid-orbital manufacturing rings, repurposed for warship maintenance and support logistics, each one capable of fielding a full fleet element on 4 hours' notice. Tier 3. The high-orbital warship formations, ranked in their patrol bands, running dark and cold and patient. The scan reached the deep orbital band. The flagship's emission profile went absolutely still. Not powering down, not retreating. The stillness of a collective mind that has just received input so far outside its predictive models that the deliberation cycle has seized, the Vreth equivalent, the archive theorized, of a human going pale. Mariku said very quietly, "They've finished the full scan." "I know," I said. The tactical display showed what the scan had found: 41,000 warships. The smallest of them was 3 times the displacement of the Vreth flagship. The largest, the deep-orbit strategic platforms, which were less ships in the conventional sense and more mobile weapons architectures the size of small moons, built over 10,000 years to a design standard that had been refined across 23 major iterations, were entities the Vreth's assessment architecture would have had no category for. The Vreth agricultural census had not included a column for what a species becomes when it spends 500,000 years building for war and never has to use it. I had thought about this moment for 31 years, what I would feel when it came. I had imagined many things. I had imagined something like triumph. I had imagined something like grief, for the people who had not lived to see it, for all the generations between the first survivors who had crawled out of the old harvest conditions and the engineers who had built the first fleet of recollection warship. I had imagined anger, perhaps. I had imagined the particular cold satisfaction that I had heard described by colleagues who had read the older psychological literature on long-deferred justice. What I felt was something quieter, something closer to the feeling of a very long weight being placed very carefully down. "Helm," I said, "bring us alongside Vigil Primary, standard intercept approach, weapons locked but not charged." Then I opened the fleet channel again. "All fleet of recollection vessels maintain position. No one moves without my direct order. We are not at war today unless they make us." I paused. "We are not going to make it easy for them to decide to fight." The unbroken record moved through the upper atmosphere, crossing from the amber light of the Veth Plateau corridor into the cleaner dark above the cloud layer, where the stars were visible, and where, if you looked toward the equatorial band, you could see the lower orbital platforms as a faint grid of moving lights. The ship handled well at atmospheric edge altitude. She was old by peacetime standards, 37 years in service, but the fleet of recollection maintained its vessels with the obsessive care of institutions that believe in longevity as a principle. The unbroken record had been commissioned before I was born. She would likely be in service after I was gone. That kind of continuity mattered in the fleet. It was not sentiment, it was doctrine. The approach took 11 minutes. The Vreth flagship did not move. Its escort vessels, reading their flagship stillness, also did not move. They held their drift formation, passive, unpowered for offensive purposes, the way the escort vessels of a harvest fleet held when the flagship's continuance cluster was in deep deliberation. The whole formation had the quality of something frozen in the middle of a step. We came alongside Vigil Primary at 400 meters. On my display, the flagship was a dark, sleek shape, older than I had expected from the intel projections, hull plating worn in ways that suggested genuine age, not cosmetic distress. The design language was consistent with what the archive had documented across multiple Vreth vessel encounters and recovered wreckage analyses: organic curves, seamless surface plating, propulsion systems distributed through the hull in a pattern that our engineers had spent decades trying to fully understand. The Vreth continuance, the archive had theorized, did not retire vessels. Vessels that worked continued to work until they stopped. This ship had been making harvest runs for a very long time. How many worlds? How many species? How many populations that had not been ready, had not remembered, had walked toward the ramp with the blood memory singing in their veins? I did not let myself linger on that. There would be time later in the archive for the full weight of that thought to land on the people who needed to carry it. My job now Was the ship alongside me, and the 9 minds deliberating inside it. Ashend opened the channel again. I said, in Vreth diplomatic standard, speaking carefully. My accent was technically correct, my intonation shaped by years of practice in the archive's language labs, but the Vreth still would not expect it, would still have to process the fact that the signal was coming not from a compliance response, but from a deliberate, educated, reciprocal interlocutor. Vreth Continuance Flagship Vigil Primary. I am Captain Marin Sohul of the Earth Unified Defense Fleet, commanding vessel Unbroken Record. You are inside Earth's sovereign defense perimeter. Your harvest code broadcast was noted and was not effective. You will power down your propulsion systems and your weapons arrays. You will not attempt to contact your escort vessels independently. You will wait. Someone is coming aboard to speak with your continuance cluster. 14 seconds. Then a response in Vreth diplomatic standard, halting, the phrasing structured in a way that the archive's linguists had long identified as the Vreth mode for addressing a situation outside their categorical framework. Not aggression, not compliance, something more like a system trying to find the correct file and failing. The message said, approximately, this world is a registered continuance holding. Compliance sequences have been transmitted. Identify the interference source. I had also, over 31 years, thought about what I would say at this moment. I had run through many versions. I had at various points imagined something eloquent, something worthy of the archive's founding injunction, something that the deep historians would eventually quote. What I said was, there is no interference source. The compliance sequences don't work anymore. They haven't worked for a very long time. Power down your systems. Someone will explain the rest in person. I released the key. I looked at Ferris. He gave me a small nod. The flagship's propulsion signature faded to standby. The escort vessels, reading their flagship's signal, followed within 90 seconds, one by one, in the careful order their doctrine required. 41,000 human warships sat in the sky above them and said nothing. I sent a boarding team. I did not go myself. Command protocol: you do not send the captain of the intercept vessel to conduct diplomatic contact with a detained harvest fleet. You send the people who have spent their careers preparing for this specific task. The archive maintained a diplomatic arm, the Recollection Corps, whose entire mandate was first contact with the Vreth, with a specific focus on the scenarios where the Vreth arrived expecting compliance and found something else entirely. The team that went aboard Vigil Primary was led by a tall, gray-haired woman named Sable Ewan, who had been working in the Recollection Corps for 40 years and who, when I had spoken with her in the hours before contact, had described her feelings about the mission with the same detached precision she brought to everything. I have been waiting to do this job my entire career. I intend to do it well. She did. What happened aboard Vigil Primary over the following 3 hours, I know from Ewan's debrief and from the sensor logs, and from the partial transcripts the Recollection Corps released to Fleet Command. I was not present for it. I held the intercept position alongside the flagship, managing the fleet coordination, monitoring the escort vessels, watching the sky above the Veth Plateau corridor lighten from deep violet to the particular pale orange of equatorial dawn, which arrived like a slow tide moving across the orbital platform grid, lighting each platform in sequence until the full ring was gold. It was, by any measure, a beautiful view. I had spent enough time on high-altitude approaches to have opinions about it. The Vreth Continuance cluster on Vigil Primary consisted of 9 individuals, a small continuance, by historical standards. The archive had documented clusters as large as 43 on previous harvest visits. 9 was consistent with the flag configuration for a reassessment mission, a preliminary approach to determine whether a dormant holding had recovered to harvestable condition. They had not sent the full harvest fleet. They had sent the assessors. Ewan met them in the flagship's central assembly space, which the Vreth used for collective deliberation, and which, by the design logic of the continuance, had no furniture. The Vreth did not sit in the human sense. They gathered in proximity, bodies oriented toward the center of a shared perceptual space, each individual contributing perception and memory to the collective processing. Ewan stood in the center of that space with 2 Recollection Corps colleagues and a portable archive terminal, and was, she said later, struck by the smell of the room more than anything else. Not unpleasant, but profoundly alien, something like ozone and warm clay. A smell she had encountered in reconstructions but never in actuality, and which hit her as a kind of confirmation. Yes, this is real, this is the thing itself, not a simulation. The Vreth were tall. The archive's biological documentation had established their general morphology from recovered genetic material and from the fragmentary visual records of earlier encounters. But morphology in the abstract was different from 9 actual Vreth standing in a room at full height, their plated bodies oriented toward the single human figure at the center of their assembly space. Ewan said they were approximately 2.5 meters at the shoulder, broader than the human proportional frame, moving with a deliberate quality that she described as neither threatening nor welcoming, the quality of large animals that had never needed to hurry. Their coloring was consistent with the archive projections, deep gray-green plates over a darker underlayer, the plates textured in a way that caught light at angles and diffused it. They smelled of ozone and clay. Their eyes, 4 per individual, the archive's biologists had established, were arranged in a horizontal band that gave them a near-full panoramic field, and all of them, all 9, tracked Ewan from the moment she entered. The continuance cluster studied her in the way that multiple Vreth studying a single thing looked like from the inside, not hostile, not curious in the human sense, but assessing, running her against their categorical models, trying to classify. She let them. She had been trained to let them. The Recollection Corps protocol for first full contact was built around a precise understanding of Vreth perceptual architecture, and the first principle of that architecture was this. The Vreth continuance processed information collectively, which meant they needed time to build consensus about what they were seeing before they could respond to it. Interrupting that process produced confusion, and in historically documented cases, aggression. Allowing it to complete produced a continuance that had reached an internal consensus and was therefore capable of genuine response. Ewan was the most patient person I had ever worked with. Standing in the center of a room full of alien life forms that had once harvested her species as livestock, waiting for them to finish categorizing her, was, she told me later, the most natural thing she had ever done. Then she activated the archive terminal. What the terminal displayed was the archive's harvest record, a 380,000-year documentation of humanity's experience with and recovery from Vreth contact. Not a summary, not a selected exhibit. The full record, presented in a format the archive's xenolinguists had spent decades adapting for Vreth perceptual architecture, because if you were going to make a thing understand what it had done, you made sure it actually understood. You did not offer excerpts. You offered everything. You had spent 380,000 years building the case, and you were going to present the whole of it, because the whole of it was the point. The biological documentation came first. The genomic evidence of the harvest implants, the compliance pathway architecture, the yield management modifications the Vreth had made across multiple generations, not just observations but the precise mechanisms, documented by human scientists who had spent centuries reverse engineering their own biology to find every trace of what had been done. The record showed the modifications, named them, explained their function, showed their distribution across the human population at the time of last confirmed Vreth contact, and then showed, modification by modification, the work of dismantling them. 200,000 years of genomic reconstruction. Not a thing done in anger, though the anger was present in the archive's earliest layers, raw and unfiltered. A thing done because the modifications were in their bodies, in the bodies of their children, and every generation that had known about them had decided that leaving them in place was not acceptable. Then the historical record, the earliest post-contact documentation, from civilizations that had come into being in the long gap between Vreth visits and had, separately, begun to reconstruct what had happened to their ancestors. The archive had recovered documentation from 6 independent civilizations on 3 separate continents, each of which had arrived, through different routes, different intellectual traditions, different recovered evidence, at the same conclusion. Something had come for us and something would come again, and we needed to be ready. Those 6 civilizations had eventually found each other. The finding had not been easy. It had taken the better part of 12,000 years, across the span of early spaceflight and the long expansion of human communication networks, before representatives of all 6 had convened in the first of the meetings that would eventually produce the founding document of the Recollection Archive. The founding meeting had lasted 3 years. The founding document was 1,100 pages long, and the archive's historians considered it one of the most important texts in human history, not because of its conclusions. The conclusions were simple enough. Remember, prepare, wait, but because of the extraordinary effort required to reach them. 6 civilizations with different histories, different interpretations of the same recovered evidence, different priorities, and yet they had agreed. On every material point they had agreed. Because the evidence was what it was, and the memory was what it was, and even across the span of distance and language and culture, the thing that had been done to their ancestors was legible. I had read the founding document twice in full before my first fleet of recollection posting, as the academies required, and had gone back to specific sections of it many times over the subsequent 3 decades. There is a passage in the second part of the document, written by the lead delegate from the oldest of the 6 founding civilizations, a woman whose name the archive preserved with scrupulous care, that I have returned to more than any other. It reads, in the standard translation, "We do not know when they will come again. We do not know whether it will be in our children's time or in a time so far beyond our imagining that the world will be unrecognizable to us. We know only that the evidence is clear, that the pattern is documented, and that the question is therefore not whether to prepare but only whether to prepare well or poorly. We have chosen to prepare well. We ask every generation that follows to make the same choice, not for us, not for their children. For the generation that will actually face it, whoever and whenever they are, build for them, remember for them. Do not let the distance in time become a reason for forgetting. The distance is the point. If it were easy to remember, it would not need to be an injunction." I thought about that passage, alongside Vigil Primary in the dark, waiting for the flagship to respond. The archive documented all of it: the founding meeting, the first fleet of Recollection Commission, a vessel built by a consortium of all 6 civilizations and launched with a ceremony that was, the archive recorded, notable for its restraint. The people who launched that first ship understood they were beginning something that would take a very long time, and they did not celebrate in ways that implied it was already finished. They noted the launch. They recorded it. They appended it to the archive. They went back to work. 380,000 years of that. 380,000 years of people deciding, generation after generation, that this was the work, not because they expected to see the Vreth in their own lifetimes, but because they understood that the work was the answer, regardless of when the question came. Ewan said the continuance cluster was still for a long time while the record played. The Vreth did not have expressions in the human sense. Their biology read differently. Their emotional states communicated through posture and a set of low-frequency vocalizations that were difficult to interpret without specialist training, and Ewan had specialist training. She said the cluster moved through several states she identified from the training as consistent with: first, disconfirmation. The input contradicts the model, and the model is resisting. Second, Collective recalibration, the model is being updated, which in breath biology was visible as a kind of synchronized postural shift, a collective reorientation of the bodies toward the information source. And third, something the archive's xenopsychologists had named simply recollection, the breath equivalent of understanding not just a fact, but the full weight of what a fact means. The difference between knowing a thing intellectually and knowing it completely. She played them the record in full. It took 2 hours and 11 minutes. When it ended, the cluster deliberated for 6 minutes. Then the senior breath in the cluster, the one whose posture the archive's training had identified as consistent with deliberation lead, distinguished by a particular arrangement of the upper plates that indicated both seniority and primary voice status, oriented toward Yuan, and produced a vocalization sequence that her translation equipment rendered as. How long did this take? She had been asked to prepare for this question. The archive had predicted it would come. They had spent considerable effort modeling what the breath would find most significant in their confrontation with the record, and had decided that the most important fact for the breath to leave with was not the military one, not the 41,000 warships, not the defense perimeter, not the irreversibility of their current situation. The most important fact was the time. Yuan said, "Your last confirmed visit to this world was 380,000 years ago. The preparation began within living memory of that visit. Every generation since has maintained it. The fleet outside has been in continuous operation in some form for longer than your continuance's recorded history. We did not build this for you specifically. We built it because we understood that forgetting would mean it could happen again, and we decided that it would not happen again." The deliberation lead breath was still. "Then we did not know you would remember." "Yes," Yuan said, "we know." There was a protocol for the disposition of the breath assessment mission. The archive had drafted it over the course of several thousand years, in consultation with every branch of the recollection structure. The Recollection Corps had refined it across 8 major revisions. The Fleet Command had approved the final version 40 years prior in anticipation. It was not punitive. It was not triumphant in the way that triumphs are usually staged. It was precise. The 9 members of the continuance cluster were not imprisoned. They were not harmed. They were transported under escort to the Recollection Archive's primary exhibition facility on the surface, in the Veth Plateau corridor, where the archive's complete harvest record was housed in a building that had been designed specifically for this purpose, had been designed, rebuilt, and expanded across 300,000 years by every generation that had contributed to it, by every person who had believed that the day would come when the breath would stand inside it and see what had been built in answer to what they had done. I accompanied the transfer. I stood at the back of the archive's central hall, a space large enough to hold a warship and lit by a particular quality of diffuse light that the architects had spent generations developing, a light that was clear and even and without drama, because they had wanted the record to be readable above all else, every detail readable, the way a document is readable, and watched the 9 members of the breath continuance walk through the record of what they were. The central hall was organized chronologically. You entered at the beginning of the documented record and walked toward the present. The earliest exhibits were small, recovered artifacts and genomic fragments from civilizations that had existed before the first breath contact could be precisely dated, civilizations whose records had been almost entirely lost and had to be reconstructed by inference and archaeology. The middle exhibits were denser, richer in documentation, covering the 6 founding civilizations and the early centuries of the archive itself. The later exhibits expanded steadily until the final section, the most recent 10,000 years of fleet of recollection development, filled a hall that was, on its own, larger than most of the buildings I had served in. The breath walked through all of it. I watched them process the genomic documentation first. The biological record of the harvest implants was presented in a format the archive had designed specifically for Vreth perceptual architecture, using the visual encoding conventions that the archive's xenolinguists had reverse-engineered from Vreth communication signals. It worked. The cluster spent 40 minutes at that section alone, the collective deliberation posture visible as they processed the implications. Their own biology, described in their own perceptual language, used against a species, and then dismantled by that species over the span of 200,000 years. The Recollection Corps observer accompanying them noted that the deliberation vocalizations at that section were significantly elevated. Not panic, not aggression, but the specific high-complexity vocalization pattern the Corps had learned to associate with the recalibration state. They walked on. I did not watch them with anger. I want to be clear about that. The archive had been founded in anger. The founding documentation made that plain, the raw, clean fury of a people who had survived something and needed to name it. But 380,000 years is a very long time, and what anger looks like after 380,000 years is not fury anymore. It is something quieter and harder and more permanent. It is the thing that makes you keep building, keep remembering, keep passing the injunction down to the next generation, not because you are still burning with it, but because you have decided as a species, as a civilization, as a people, that this particular memory will not be allowed to dissolve. Not because hatred demands it, because dignity does. The Vreth assessment mission spent 48 hours in the archive. They were fed. The archive's protocols included provisions for Vreth dietary requirements, documented thoroughly from biological evidence and managed. The logistics team later reported without incident. They were given access to the full record. They were allowed to deliberate collectively for as long as they needed. They were not threatened. They were shown, as completely as we knew how to show it, exactly what had been done to us, and exactly what we had become because of it. I slept on a cot in one of the archive's staff rooms. I had a long conversation with Sable Ewan on the second evening, in the staff canteen, over food that was not remarkable but was warm and plentiful, because the archive fed its people well and had for 300,000 years. We talked about the founding document. We talked about the 6 civilizations and their first meeting and the 1,100 pages that had come out of it. We talked about the people who had built the first fleet of recollection vessel and launched it knowing they would never see it used. Ewan said she had read the launch ceremony transcripts so many times she had parts of them memorized. I said I had too. We did not say much more than that. We did not need to. On the morning of the third day, Ewan brought me their collective response. It was not an apology. The archive had not expected an apology and had not built its protocol around one. An apology from the Vreth would have required a category of self-reflection that their biology and collective mind architecture might not have supported. The archive's xenopsychologists had spent decades debating the question and had reached no consensus, only a shared professional caution against expecting from the Vreth what was natural to humans. What the continuance cluster produced instead was a declaration, in Vreth diplomatic standard, formal register, structured in the mode the archive's linguists identified as equivalent to a binding institutional statement, carrying the same weight in Vreth law that a founding document carried in human institutional tradition. The declaration read, in translation, "This world is not a holding of the Vreth continuance. This world will not be approached for harvest purposes. This declaration will be entered into the continuance's agricultural registry as a permanent status revision. We will carry the record. We will carry the record." Ewan, who did not cry easily, I had served with her for 6 years and had never seen it, told me she had cried when she translated that line. Not from relief. Not from the particular release that comes at the end of something long. From the recognition that 380,000 years of keeping a record had produced, in the end, a moment when the people who had authored the original wrong were going to keep their own record of it. That the memory, in some form, was going to travel further than we had ever planned for. that the work had not only defended a world, it had changed something in the architecture of the thing that had once come for us, and the change would persist, carried outward in a Vreth flagship, into a galaxy that would eventually know what humanity had done with the time it had been given. I sat with that for a long moment. Then I folded the translated declaration, put it in my jacket and said, "Tell them they can go." The Vreth assessment mission was escorted back to Vigil Primary. Their vessels were released from the defense perimeter in the order they had arrived. The escort ships went first, the 10 subordinate vessels, which had sat powered down in the orbital band for 3 days without incident, their crews presumably receiving compressed updates from the continuance cluster through whatever internal communication channels the Vreth used between a flagship and its formation. They moved out of the orbital bands in sequence, each one registering on Moriku's passive feed and then fading as they cleared the threshold. Clean, orderly. Then the flagship last, backing slowly out of the atmosphere, its hull catching the morning sun at an angle that threw a long shadow across the upper cloud layer before it cleared the shadow line and the shadow dissolved. I watched it on the bridge display and through the forward transparency simultaneously. The display gave me the technical truth of it, the emission profile and the trajectory, and the fold transit pre-signature building in the deep sensor returns. The transparency gave me the human truth of it, which was a dark shape growing smaller against a sky that was bright and clear and full of the orbital ring catching its morning light. The fold transit signature bloomed. And then it was gone. The fleet channel was quiet. I let the quiet hold for a moment. Around me, 40 officers at their stations, the hum of the ship's systems, the light of the equatorial dawn coming through the forward transparency. Below us, the Veth Plateau corridor, 11 billion people living in the morning light, none of whom had needed to know that we were here, that any of this had happened, because the fleet of recollection existed precisely so that the world below could continue existing exactly as it was. Vast and alive and unharvested. Ours. I thought about the founding document, the single injunction at the top of every fleet of recollection commission: remember, prepare, wait. And then, below it, in smaller script, the line that was added 300,000 years after the founding, by a generation that had decided the injunction needed a fourth word. A word for what came after the waiting, if the waiting ended as it was supposed to end. Remember, prepare, wait, release. I took the folded declaration out of my jacket and looked at it for a long moment. The translation in Ewan's handwriting on one side, the original Vreth script on the other, which I could read imperfectly, enough to pick out the closing phrase, the part that mattered. We will carry the record. The declaration would go to the archive. It would be logged, catalogued, appended to the record of this contact, and read by every generation that followed ours. It would sit alongside the founding document and the launch logs of the first fleet of recollection vessel, and the accounts of 17 prior commanders who had trained for this day and never seen it. It would be available to the generation that came after us, so that they understood not only what had been built before them, but what the building had, in the end, produced. I put it back. "All fleet of recollection vessels," I said on the fleet channel, "this is Captain Sohul aboard Unbroken Record. Contact is resolved. Stand down to Pale Vigil Hold. Well done." Then I closed the channel, because there was nothing more to say that the 31 years hadn't already said, and nothing more to do that 500,000 years of preparation hadn't already done. The Unbroken Record turned slowly and descended back into the light. I am writing this account 13 months after the event, at the request of the Recollection Archive's historical branch, which maintains a standing practice of soliciting first-person accounts from fleet of recollection commanders who have held active intercept command. The practice is 320,000 years old. Every account goes into the archive. Every account is read by the generation that follows. I read the accounts of 17 prior commanders before I held my first commission, and I have gone back to several of them in the months since the Vreth departed, looking for the specific passages that I remembered most clearly from those early readings, and finding them again, older now, understanding them differently. One thing I want to be honest about, because the archive's historical branch asks for honesty, and because I believe the accounts are only useful if they are honest. I was frightened for part of that morning. Not of the Vreth, not in the direct sense. The 41,000 warships and the layered defense perimeter and 31 years of preparation had worked to neutralize any fear that was purely tactical in nature. When I looked at Vigil Primary on my display, I did not feel the fear of physical threat. What I felt, in the hours between contact confirmation and the moment the flagship powered down its systems, was something more like the fear of the long thing failing at the last step. The fear that we had built all of this, across all of those generations, and that some variable we had failed to anticipate would cause it to go wrong in a way that the people who came before us had not been able to predict and therefore could not have prepared us for. That fear is, I think, appropriate. It is the fear that keeps the preparation honest. It is the thing that makes you check the figures again and run the drill one more time and read the accounts of the commanders who came before you, because there is something in those accounts that is only available to people who have held the same kind of responsibility and felt the same kind of weight. The archive's historical branch understands this. It is why they collect the accounts. The fear passed when the flagship powered down. Or rather, it did not pass so much as it became unnecessary. It had been doing its job, which was to keep me alert and precise, and when it was no longer needed it faded in the way useful things fade when they have been used. What remained was not relief exactly, something more settled. Something that I think might be what the founding generation felt when they finished the founding document and knew that the work was actually begun, not completed, not resolved, but correctly aimed and in motion. I have thought often in the 13 months since about the Vreth Declaration. We will carry the record. I have thought about what it means for that statement to exist in the institutional language of the Vreth continuance, formally entered into their agricultural registry, which is, the archive's xenolinguists have established, one of the oldest and most meticulously maintained archives in the Vreth's own institutional tradition. The thing that was done to us, documented by us, delivered to the people who did it, and now carried forward by them. Not as a confession. The Vreth are not built for confession in the human sense, and I have stopped expecting them to be. As a fact in their record. As a status revision that will propagate through every Vreth system that reads the agricultural registry. Other worlds that might have been next, in whatever harvest cycle the Vreth were running, will not find the Vreth at their threshold. The declaration carries further than us. That was not something the founding document anticipated, because the founding generation could not have known what the Vreth would do when confronted with the full record. They built the archive and the fleet and the defense perimeter to defend one world. The declaration extends the protection beyond what was intended. I do not know how to feel about that precisely. I have asked Ewan, and she has thought about it for a long time and has said something that I have found useful, which is, the founding generation did not build for a specific outcome. They built for the principle that what was done to us should not be allowed to happen again, to us or to anyone we could reach, was always larger than a single world's defense. They just did not have the means to extend it further. We did because of everything they built. The declaration is what happens when the principle reaches the people who violated it. It is the principle doing its full work. That seems right to me. I am still not entirely certain, but it seems right. I have been asked by several people in the 13 months since whether I said anything when the flagship finally disappeared from the sensor return, whether there was a moment, a word, something equal to the occasion. I have told them honestly, no. I closed the fleet channel after the stand-down order and did not speak again for approximately 4 minutes, during which time I sat in my command chair and looked at the orbital ring through the forward transparency, and thought about nothing very specifically. The way you sometimes think about nothing after a very long thing has resolved. Then Moriku said quietly from her station, "Clean fold, they're gone." And I said, "Yes." And that was it, that was the whole of it. The thing that had been coming for 500,000 years had come, and we had been ready, and it had gone. And the sky above the Veth Plateau corridor was bright and clear, and full of the architecture, of 500 millennia of preparation that did not need to be explained because it existed. And the work that made it exist had been done by people who would never know this morning and whose names were in the archive, and whose accounts were in the historical branch, and who, every last one of them, deserved the morning. I do not know how else to end this account. The archive's historical branch has not suggested a form. They ask only for honesty and completeness, and I have tried to give them both. We were ready. We had been ready for a very long time. The readiness was not mine. It was not my generation's. It belonged to every generation that had decided, when they could have decided otherwise, that the memory was worth keeping, and the preparation was worth doing, and the waiting was worth enduring. I happened to be the one in the command chair on the morning the waiting ended. I am grateful for that. I am grateful in a way that I find difficult to express without sounding insufficient, because the gratitude I feel is not for myself, but for all the people who made it possible for me to be grateful at all. The fleet of recollection stands, the archive stands, the sky is ours. We had not forgotten, we had never forgotten, and in the end neither did they.